I want to talk about an HR law-related topic today, and this is not in your textbook, and in fact, you probably are not going to find it in any textbooks because it's a relatively new area of study, but it's an area in which I do some research, and I guess I believe really strongly about it, and I advise companies and employees in this area, and this is the problem of workplace bullying and abusive conduct at work. All right, so you may talk about this if you go on and take HR classes. You may start to talk about this, but it's a relatively new construct. And I think it's something that's really important for employment law and workplace law because you guys, most of you are going to start your careers at some level of management, and you're going to have people who report to you, and they may come to you with this problem, and you need to know how to help them or advise them. And hopefully it does not happen to you, but sheer numbers-wise, the odds are that you may find yourself in a situation where this is going on. And so I hope to give you some tools to extricate yourself from that situation. You have more slides than I'm going to show today. I kind of pared this down just to make sure I can get it all done in one session. But kind of give you a roadmap for the presentation. I want to talk about the definition of workplace bullying, what it is and what it isn't. I want to talk about the bottom line costs to business in dollars. I want to talk about the ethical issues. What are the right or wrong things to do in these situations? Then I want to talk about the legal issues that surround this, because it is increasingly an HR law topic. At first it was just a HR issue. Now we're starting to see some legal frameworks around this. And then I'll share some research with you about possible organizational solutions as well. So many times people misunderstand what bullying in the workplace is. They think, oh, somebody was rude to me, or they made a face at me, or they didn't say hi. There's one faculty member, I see him a lot downtown. I always say hi to him, and I know he's not going to say hi to me, right? That's just him, okay? It's not bullying. That's just, it is whatever it is. Disagreeability, perhaps. So not every kind of workplace incivility rises to this level. So as we start to study this this is not a new phenomenon by any means, but researchers studying it is new. And so we're trying to get our arms around it and figure out, how do you define this problem? How do you separate it from other kinds of conduct? And so we start to look at 4 different factors: the power disparity, intensity, repetition, and duration. Okay? So power disparity is one of the key things. A lot of people think that only a boss or a supervisor can be in the position of bullying an employee. In fact, a lot of the clients that I've advised on this are getting bullied by somebody who they do not report to. It could be a peer, it could be a manager in another part of the work unit, but it's somebody who has some power over them. And that can be resource power, like this person decides how salaries and raises are distributed. It could be that person has a personal relationship, like I've seen ones where they're the son-in-law of the CEO, right? That could be a situation where that person has more power than their position would indicate. It could be that this bully is a top performer, and so they're being protected by management because they bring in a lot of revenue. The key thing is that the target doesn't feel like they're able to just stop the abuse. So sometimes people give the bad advice, well, if somebody's bullying you at work, just give it right back to them. It ain't the same as schoolyard bullying, okay? We all have seen the movies where the schoolyard bully pushes a little kid around, then the little kid hits him, and the bully cries and runs away, whatever. You can't go around hitting people at work, and normally you're not in a position to resist or change this kind of behavior directly with the bully because they have something they're holding over you, okay? So power disparity is one of the keys, but it doesn't have to come from a reporting relationship. Another key element is intensity. So I told you about a guy who just doesn't say hi to me, right? There are other folks who I've worked with over the years who've criticized my work, said, you know, you could have done better here, or maybe you could have been more moderate on this, or maybe you could have worked harder on this project, okay? That's not bullying, that's performance management, right? Whether it's justified or not, if it's directed at the work, that's work-related criticism, and that's okay. It's, when you see bullying, it's really where you see a person trying to push somebody out, destroy their career, undermine them, or make them so uncomfortable that they have to leave. And as you know from the last unit, you start to think about constructive termination claims when somebody makes your job so hard that you feel like you have to leave, right? So that's something to think about there. Is there an intent to harm the person, and is it being directed, is the criticism directed at the person instead of the work? If you have those factors, it starts to look more like workplace bullying and not just tough criticism. Repetition and duration, all right? So I told you as management researchers, we're trying to get a picture of this construct. What is bullying? What is abusive supervision? What is incivility? We have all these different topics we talk about. So, you know, kind of the leading paper on this says, well, it's got to happen 2 times a week for 6 months. That seems arbitrary to me, right? I kind of like law because we have these totality of the circumstances tests. So I don't really buy that it has to happen for 6 months, 2 times a week. What if your bully takes a vacation? What if it happens for 5 months? 5 months of this is 5 months of hell, okay? So I'm just sharing with you some of the research on it, but I would say it could actually be happening in a shorter time period than that. But what I do agree with here is that it's a constant, all right? So everybody has bad days, and everybody lashes out at their coworkers from time to time. So maybe a person has a bad day, they go after you, and the behavior is not repeated, all right? Then that doesn't really look like bullying. That looks like a bad day and a bad response. When people are caught in these situations, the bully keeps the pressure on for a long period of time. So just reiterate, is the criticism directed at the work or the worker? Because directing criticism against somebody's work, if it's done helpfully, is just good performance management. But criticizing them personally is probably not helpful. So what is the cost of all this? Because, you know, I present this to a lot of different folks. I present it to you guys because you're going to be in the workforce. You're probably in the workforce in some capacity right now. I present this stuff to doctors, to lawyers, nurses, insurance people who are in the industry affected by this. And I think we can all agree that bullying is bad, right? I don't think you'd find anyone who stands up for it and says it's a good thing. But it's really hard to change people's minds by making that kind of argument. So what I like to show is how much this costs a company. How much does it cost the bottom line? All right? Well, first of all, how often does it happen and to how many people? I shared with you on ICON 2 different surveys taken 4 years apart by the Workplace Bullying Institute. They are a think tank of academics and psychologists who study this problem, and they gather lots of research on it. So they found that about 1/5 of the workforce had been bullied at some time, 20%. 7% of people were currently going through this. About another 1/5 had witnessed it. About another 1/4 were aware of the problem. So we're looking at 27 to 35% between the two surveys of U.S. workers have experienced this firsthand. And then you've got these folks who are witnessing it as well. I have another slide. I took it out for this, but if you were to extrapolate this to the U.S. working population, it would essentially be the population of all the states in the middle of the U.S. Anecdotally, nursing is a field that's been studied a lot for this. It's a high-pressure field. You've got a lot of different people in different levels of hierarchy, and of course, you're dealing with patient health, which is very high stakes, and this is a real problem. So one study found that 60% of new nurses left their job, their first job, within 6 months because of bullying from a colleague. And it's not all doctors bullying nurses, it's nurses too. Famous book on the nursing field is called Nurses Eat Their Young. A lot of my family members are nurses, and they've confirmed this is a huge problem. So turnover is a big cost. Okay, it generally costs about 1.5 times an employee's salary to replace them when you factor in recruitment and the knowledge that you lose and the time that you lose and all that. So if you lose somebody who's making $50,000 a year, it's probably going to cost you $75,000 to replace them. So that's a cost, right? Well, what about this other stuff like absenteeism and presenteeism? You've probably heard of the first one, but not the second. All right? Absenteeism, quite honestly, when people are going through this kind of conduct, they will take sick days to avoid it. Sometimes you can discover this, those of you guys who are in analytics or big data analysis. If you have a work unit where a disproportionate number of people are missing Mondays, you either have a lot of heavy drinkers or possibly you have a bully in that unit and people aren't coming in because they don't want to deal with that abuse. There's something called the Sunday night syndrome. I hope none of you guys have ever had this, but I had it once at a job where Sunday night you realize you have to go into that place tomorrow to work and you start to feel sick. And it can actually turn into a real physical illness. There's one unit of a company where I represented an employee. They had customarily 70% turnover every year. They had a bully in there as their head person. 70% of the people were leaving their job every year. And the other people were checking into the hospital with mysterious stomach complaints and infections that got out of control and all these things. And it was because they were so beaten down, they were getting sick. Then you got the opposite example of presenteeism. I'm guessing some of you guys probably fall victim to this at some of your jobs sometimes. It's where you really don't want to go to work, but you have to go. You have to make money, so you show up, and you go on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, play a video game. You're there in body, but you're not getting anything done, right? So that, we've all had jobs kind of like that. So that's another symptom of this that can come out. So you lose a lot of productivity, and it costs the company money. Now, what about, like I said, I shared with you some of the physical injuries that can occur. What about mental injuries? This is an area where I do research, is mental injuries, and you think that sounds weird. Does that mean like getting hit in the head with something? Well, that's one way it can come about. So I study people who get hurt at work, and sometimes they get hit with something in the head, and it makes them, changes their personality or makes them unable to work. But sometimes stress can do that too. So we know that targets of abuse and bullying at work tend to have a higher risk of depression. You've probably heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's something called PDSD, prolonged duress stress disorder. So instead of one or two really traumatic incidents, it's the constant beating down of an employee by a coworker who is bullying them. People tend to self-medicate with alcohol, so they fall victim to alcohol or drug abuse, and unfortunately a number of people who experience this commit suicide. So we see the headlines about school kids who get bullied and commit suicide. You don't see those headlines about workers, but it happens to grown-ups too. All right. A lot of people end up leaving the workforce. They go on short or long-term disability, or they just withdraw from the workforce completely, and they may not be able to come back in. So that's a cost to business as well. How do we put numbers on that? Well, it's hard to do because health information is private for good reason. But we know a few things. We've got a study from 2001, so it's an older study. I would guess these numbers have only gone up. But we know that workers with depression take 1.5 to 3 times more short-term disability days. And of course, the company and the insurer has to pay for those. At this time, the annual health care cost for an employee who did not have depression was about $3,000. An employee with depression, about $11,000, so more than 3 times. One who has depression and takes disability leave, about $14,000. All right? These numbers are 16 years old. I'm sure you can scale them up quite a bit and see that the healthcare cost gets a lot higher. And there's spillover effects. I don't know if any of you guys have ever worked somewhere where somebody was getting bullied, but it's a really uncomfortable experience, right? Because you start to think, why isn't the company doing anything? Okay, when this guy leaves, as they often do, am I going to be the one who gets this treatment next? And we know from our unit on ethics that there's a contagion effect with unethical behavior. And this kind of mistreatment is definitely unethical behavior. People see this, and there are studies that show when you witness bullying, you're going to engage in more what we call CWBs, counterproductive workplace behaviors. People will start loafing, taking more time to play around on the internet or whatever, down to stealing office supplies, down to embezzling, down to mistreating other employees because they see the behavior is not punished. So they're just like, oh, I guess anything goes here. It's kind of the unconscious process. Now, what about legal costs? All right. There's not a cause of action in tort right now for workplace bullying. All right. So, we talked about a lot of different things that you could sue people for in terms of injuries. If you slip and fall at your employer, then you can sue them for whatever the medical costs were. But if your boss bullies you, well, there's not really a tort cause of action for that right now. Now, if they fire you on top of the bullying, then maybe you've got some of the employment law remedies that we talked about, and we'll get into those in a minute. But if you want to bring suit right now, there's workers' comp, which we'll talk about, for your compensation for your injuries, or maybe you've got this intentional infliction of emotional distress. Remember we talked about that? That's outrageous kind of thing. So if somebody is really being awful to you and you have some damages, maybe. However, flip side of that, I think I told you guys several times that anybody can sue anyone for anything at any time. Doesn't mean you're going to win, but you can do it, all right? So if you bring a suit against your employer for bullying, IED, if that's how you structure it, or if you structure it as a wrongful termination, they still have to defend that suit, right? And so one estimate says that the cost of investigating a bullying complaint and defending it is somewhere between $30,000 and $60,000 right now, okay, for the employer. So that doesn't count any judgment that might be awarded if your cause is found to have merit. And then there's a reputational issue too. So a lot of companies right now are getting into trouble with this. Uber is a prime example. So there you've got employees who are one guy threatened to bash his coworker's skull in with a baseball bat because he didn't like the idea he had in a meeting. That's not okay, right? You've got employees doing all kind of crazy things there. Amazon was kind of famous for a while for having this anything goes culture. They've reined it in a little bit now. But Amazon and Uber are still, while they're cool tech companies, it's also like, is that what you want? Do you want to go to work and get threatened to have your skull bashed in? I don't. I wouldn't like that very much. So there's a reputational aspect to it. Once you get sued for this, or once somebody files a claim and the media picks up on it, it has a really reputational aspect that hurts your company, and it may hurt your recruiting. So my kind of bottom line theory on this is that bullies persist because organizations allow them to. These folks may be high performers. I think we all know, if we take the example from sports, I won't put any names out there, but I'm sure whatever your favorite sports team is, at one time they had a high-paid, high performer who was a bad influence in the locker room, right? You've heard of that? You know, I think we've all heard of that guy, you know. And, well, let's just use Randy Moss as an example. If you guys remember him, played for many years. And my team, the Green Bay Packers, everybody was, I was hoping they would sign him. And they kind of looked at him and said, oh, this guy runs and catches the ball really well, but he's just a pain in the ass. You know, he's bad to his coworkers, right? And, you know, eventually the Oakland signed him and the Patriots and whatever. But too many organizations look just at the top line. What is this person's production? They don't look at all the costs. And if you start to tally up all those costs that I gave you, I think you'll see these guys put you in the negative. And by guys, I mean that generally. It's not just men that commit this behavior. It's women as well. More often men. So some ethical issues. Well, I just went back, pulled out my ethical decision-making model, and thought, how do I start to tackle this problem? All right, so I live east of town, and I usually drive I-80 in, and there's some brand of trucking company that has this signage, advertising on the back, and it says, our most valued asset sits 60 feet to the front, you know, and then it points to the cab of the truck. And I thought, oh, that's nice. You know, they like their drivers, their employees, whatever. I started thinking about that. I'm like, I'm not sure I've ever heard of a company that doesn't say something like that. So I Googled the phrase, our people are our most valued asset. 89,800,000 results. Seems like everybody says their people are their most valued asset. How many of them come through with it? Why do we have so many wrongful termination suits? Why do we have so many discrimination suits? Why do we have stories in the news about people threatening each other with baseball bats? Does that really show the value? Does that walk the walk? Or are they just saying this, right? What are some of the critical facts? Well, the costs. If we're going to make the case about this stuff from an HR standpoint, we got to talk about the costs that these folks are costing the companies and the shareholders. What about public perception? Okay, do you want to go get a job at Uber right now? Doesn't sound like a happy place. Employee health. Okay, these folks make your organization sick. That's a problem. Lost profits. We'll talk about that. You know, who are the stakeholders in all this? Well, the target of the bullying. The coworkers, the observers, subordinates, because we know that this behavior sort of cascades downwards. So sometimes somebody who's being targeted for bullying will actually engage in that behavior later as well. The shareholders, okay? If they knew the costs that these folks were incurring, would they want managers to do something different? I think they would. Management as a whole, who is often somewhat ignorant of this issue. The families of the targets and the perpetrators themselves. What is causing them to do this? Are they also being bullied? Where do they come by this? So that leads me to an interesting point and a misconception that I really want to correct. All right? The schoolyard bully probably chooses their targets based on weakness. I know this because I was once a target of that, right? I'm short. I'm not really good at sports, you know, so that kind of made me, you know, get some of the, I like books a lot, you know. I think everybody knew I wasn't going to be a pro athlete. I was probably going to be a professor. So I'm familiar with that kind of targeting. And people think that's how it goes in the workplace too. But it's actually about 180 degrees different. So what I have seen in my law practice and what is confirmed by research that is coming out is that workplace bullies choose people who are strong. They choose people who are up and coming and therefore a threat to them. And this is why you guys are at risk for this, okay? The typical prospective client that would come to me is about, I don't know, 25 to 30 years old. All right? It's somebody who's got a degree, whether it's a business degree or a professional degree or an MBA, and they get into the workplace and you're a go-getter, you're an up-and-comer, right? And the people that you report to, they're more like that baby boomer generation. They got to where they are through, some of them have a business education, but some of them have just a high school degree, and they got there through seniority and hard work and just kind of being there a long time. So they see somebody come out and they're like, oh, you know, this person's a hot shot. If I'm not careful, within 2 years, they're going to have my job. So they start targeting you, getting you to feel bad about the organization and hopefully leave, and that's how they keep their power. All right? So that's why you're at risk. And it's a big misconception. People think they pick the weak person. No, they pick the strong person. And it's devastating because you guys come out and you're very excited about starting a new job and doing well and being upwardly mobile, and here's this person who's trying to take your career right off track. It's a big problem. So some of the legal issues, what are we doing to address this, if anything, through legislation? Not much is the answer. So you may be familiar in Iowa that we have some protections for school kids against bullying. And remember that Iowa Civil Rights Commission I talked about last time that handles workplace discrimination? Well, we've changed our state law to allow them to also handle complaints of school bullying. However, we have not extended that legal protection to our workers. That could be a problem, as Judge Judy would say, right? So I talked a lot last time about protected classes and what that means, okay? Race, gender, religion, creed, age, pregnancy, disability. If somebody is bullying you because of your membership in a protected class, then you've got a case, right? If somebody's like, hey, Bob, you're in a wheelchair, so I'm going to bully you, you know, or whatever. Or they do it because you're a woman or because you're young, all right? Then you can go through that process of filing a complaint and asking for some redress for that. However, what we know from research is that these things are not usually motivated by those demographic factors. They're motivated by your high performance, okay? So that's not a protected class. You can't go into the court and say, I should be allowed to file a civil rights claim because this person's discriminating against me for doing good work. You'll just get laughed out of court. We don't have that. You know, I told you there are things like IIED that you could claim, and some lawyers tell me that they've been successful with that. Sometimes the bullies will tie in their behavior with a bit of sexual harassment or gender discrimination, so you can tie in with that. Sometimes they'll get physical, so then you can tie in an assault claim. But usually they're pretty clever about not crossing those lines, because there's lots of education around those things. You go to work for a company, one of the first things you're going to get is probably sexual harassment training and policy. You're going to have to sign something saying you did it. I had to do that to teach this class. You know, so you're going to get educated on that. You're going to get educated on disability stuff. All right? You're probably not going to get educated on bullying or workplace conduct because it's not technically illegal. All right? So what happens to people who get hurt by this? Well, sometimes they just leave their job and take a different one. Sometimes they leave the workforce. Sometimes they will file a claim in the workers' comp system, which we'll talk about as well. So this just talks about the status blindness of most bullying. All right. So in 80% of the cases, the victim and the target and the perpetrator are demographically similar. Okay. Workers' comp is something that you may have heard of, and it ties in nicely with our kind of HR law, employment law part here. So if you get hurt on the job, the idea is that you can apply for this system and you can get your medical bills paid. This has kind of been in the news lately as there have been some changes in workers' comp law in Iowa. But essentially the companies pay into an insurance fund and you're supposed to get compensated if you get hurt at work. And in exchange, you give up the right to sue your employer for negligence. Now, if your employer does something that's reckless or commits an intentional tort against you, you can still sue for that. But this is a system that state law puts in place to kind of protect employers. It's supposed to protect employees too. It doesn't do a very good job of that, okay? So essentially, you're injured at work. You go see a doctor appointed by your employer. They look you over, they make a determination, and they say, yeah, you're going to be out for 6 weeks, and, with this injury, and we're going to pay for your medical bills, or sometimes they'll say there's nothing wrong with you, get back to work, put some duct tape on it and go back to work. Then you go get your own doctor, and they say, no, this guy's got a ruptured disc or whatever, and he needs time off. If the employer doesn't agree with your doctor, then you have to file a claim, and you may have to have a trial where you introduce medical testimony to get your expenses paid. If you win, the employer has to pay your legal fees. But it can be kind of an uphill fight. So I've read hundreds, if not thousands, of these cases, both from Iowa and from the federal system, and the vast majority of them have to do with physical injuries. Somebody gets hit by a forklift and their back is hurt, okay? But my research focuses on mental injuries. So there's physical mental, which is like you get hit in the head by a box, it changes your personality, you can no longer concentrate, you can't work, you've got a mental injury caused by a physical source. And then there's what they call mental injuries, which is just you had stress or a shock or something that caused you to develop anxiety, depression, whatever, okay? Federal law allows you to recover for those mental injuries, as does Iowa law. Some states don't. So I did a study on these cases of mental injuries and trying to figure out how many plaintiffs actually got compensated for their injuries. And the number is very, very low. All right? In the federal system, I had 4,000 cases in my sample, and I found about 11% of plaintiffs actually got compensated for their mental injuries on the job. In Iowa, we have a far smaller number of cases, but the percentage was similar. So just to give you an idea of what kind of abuse people face at work, this is from Swift Meatpacking, somewhere in central or western Iowa. Guy had an abusive boss, bullying boss. Boss hit him in the face with a tenderloin. All right? Now, this isn't like your sandwich you get at Jonesy's, like a little tenderloin. He's talking about this whole thing minus the ribs. I had to present this in California. They didn't know what a tenderloin was, so I had to get the clip art and show them, all right? It's like a baseball bat of meat, essentially. The boss is hitting him in the face with this. I'm guessing it's frozen because they work at a meatpacking plant. I don't know. You think that sounds like a pretty cut and dried example of workplace bullying? Boss hits you with baseball bat of meat? Well, we have a pretty high standard in Iowa, all right? If you're going to get damages for workplace stress, you not only have to show that the stress caused your injury, but you have to show that your workplace was much more stressful than others in its industry, okay? Unquestionably, this packing plant is more stressful than being a professor. Nobody's ever brought a tenderloin to a faculty meeting and started swinging it around. But apparently this is not uncommon for meatpacking plants because the judge found that this was not significantly more stressful than other meatpacking plants. Nothing for you, no money for you. Wow, right? I just had case after case after case like this. All right, I put a couple other examples in your slides you can look at. But the point is it's very hard for plaintiffs to win in that system. It's very hard for them to win through a tort claim, right? The legal remedies for this are not good right now. So what can an organization do, or what can you as a manager do? Some of you guys will go into HR. Some of you guys will go into law. Some of you will go into general management. And some of you guys will go work at places where you don't do any of those things, but you may run into this problem, okay? So what can an organization do? Well, I put a brief article in there that you might find interesting. And it's the Ferris article. And Ferris was a counseling psychologist. And she didn't set out, I don't think, to do a research study on this. But she started having a number of clients coming in who'd been bullied at work. And with their permission, she started to gather data about what happened and how did your organization respond. And her dependent variable was how many months of counseling was needed with these folks before they could re-enter the workforce. So she looked at this and kind of found that these folks fell into three fairly distinct groups. The key takeaway from this is that bullying is a problem, but handling it wrong makes it even worse from an org standpoint. So she called the first kind of organizations see no evil. And these were companies that made a choice to allow this behavior. Any of you guys seen The Wolf of Wall Street? Great film, right? I've worked at places like that. Not quite that bad, but in some ways, yeah. All right, if you haven't seen the film, it's about a stock brokerage that was doing a lot of unethical things, and they did crazy, insane things to each other at work. All right, just put it that way. If you have 3.5 hours to watch it, it's on Netflix. It's an interesting film. For those of you who are going to go into finance, I think it's required watching. So some of these small to medium for-profits in competitive industries just say, you know what, suck it up, buttercup. You're getting bullied, too bad. Do the work, all right? Obviously, that's a harmful response when your employee comes to you with this. So these folks needed a fair amount of counseling to reintegrate into the workforce. Law firms would fall into this category. Second kind of response was the hear no evil. So this is where you work for a company or an organization, I should say, because this happens at nonprofits and hospitals and universities and all kind of different orgs. You work for an organization that has a good front, okay? They have workplace conduct policy. They have training on this. Maybe they have an ombudsperson who's supposed to handle these issues. And they encourage you to come forward and do whistleblowing, essentially. What people often find is when they come forward with these complaints, sometimes these organizations are not their friend. They take the complaint, they gather the information, they use it to fire the employee who made the complaint because it's just easier for them to do that and ignore the problem. All right? This was the most harmful response. These folks who felt doubly betrayed took the longest amount of time to reintegrate into the workforce. You would often see this with like a large governmental or bureaucratic organization. So they have the policies, they have the written policies in place, they have the structures, but they don't follow through with them. The last group, speak no evil. This was the effective response. Okay, it's an organization who acknowledges bullying behavior is harmful, and they don't condone it, all right? These organizations, they actually listen. When an employee makes a complaint, they investigate it, they take corrective action. It could be as simple as changing somebody's work unit, or it could be as difficult as terminating the bully, okay? And that's never an easy thing to do, but sometimes that's the right thing to do. Interestingly, almost all of these organizations in the study got to this place because they'd been sued in the past, or they had a high-profile incident. The study came out of Canada. Their laws are a little bit more pro-employee on this point. So these organizations kind of came to this after they had a bad experience. But this was the most helpful response, right? So those are my thoughts on this. I hope you found it interesting. I realize it's kind of a heavy subject. But I hope to see you guys on Tuesday for the review, and we'll go from there.